Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we connect people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. I'm Geoff Pallay, and thanks for being with us. Today I'm joined by Ryan Byrne for our monthly dive into ballot measure history. We're on a mission to bring you the most comprehensive database of American ballot measure history out there. We're working towards publishing what we call fact books on all 50 states. You'll hear us highlight a different state each month. In March, we ran through Ohio. April, we tackled California. And for May this month, we'll be combing through the rich ballot measure history in Oregon. Since 1900, Oregon has seen more statewide ballot measures than, well, almost any state. From decriminalizing drugs and legalizing psilocybin to narrowly passing one of the country's strictest gun control laws, Oregon's democracy system has helped shape the national conversation. Today, we're taking a step back to explore what all that history can tell us about voters, about democracy, and about how change really happens at the ballot box. So let's dig into Oregon and get into some of the history from the West Coast. So, Ryan, welcome back to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Geoff.
I love our little ballot measure chats. It's so fun to explore kind of the history of how initiatives and sort of constitutions were changed. So, let's get into Oregon, which is not the most dull place. So Oregon didn't just follow the direct democracy trend, kind of helped set it in motion. What made Oregon such a fertile ground for ballot initiatives in the first place?
Yeah, so we've discussed this before on the
Yep.
podcast. The initiative and referendum process emerged during this period of public concern and agitation about concentrated economic and political power. And Oregon's really no different, but there are certain things that make it quite unique. Fertile ground, as you said. I could start off about rail barons, and we'll get into that. But I think it's actually fun to think about the geography a little bit and how that played a role in making Oregon a fertile ground for ballot initiatives. So let's start with rivers and mountains. Kind of feel like I need a whiteboard and a map for this, so bear with me. Those of you out west will probably understand this a little bit better. So most of the population lives in or around the Willamette Valley. That's where Portland is, things like that. It sits between two major mountain ranges, the Coast Range and the Cascades. The Cascades form a steep, rugged north-south spine that it's pretty tough to cross. But there's one major exception. That's the Columbia River. The Columbia cuts through the mountains from east to west, carving out the Cascade River Gorge, and is the only navigable route through the Cascades, especially, in the 1800s, early 1900s, before the onset of highways and things like that. So control of the Columbia mattered a lot, and those who controlled the river, in a sense, controlled the flow of goods, people, and the state's economic development. Now, the railroads actually controlled much of the Columbia River waterfront and often successfully opposed efforts to fund public port and dredging projects. So, comes in the initiative and referendum characters, the populist, and they're kind of arguing that these out of state rail interests are keeping Oregon economically dependent on them, that it's intentional. They even describe the state as, quote, a dependent colonial outpost. So once voters actually get the initiative power at the local level, this is one of the first things they address in Portland. They create
Hmm.
a public docs commission to get around this. But that's jumping ahead a bit.
So who stepped in to challenge that power, and how did the push for reform actually take shape there?
Yeah, so there's this interesting character from Oregon named William Uren. He's a lawyer from Wisconsin via Colorado and Hawaii. He moved out west to kind of get away from certain air quality issues because he had tuberculosis.
Okay.
Yeah, there's great story behind him. There's these people are always such fascinating characters. So Uren wasn't the first to advocate for the initiative and referendum in Oregon, but he was an effective, or at least very persistent organizer. Here's how the Oregonian described him in 1906. In Oregon, the state government is divided into four departments: the executive, judicial, legislative, and Mr. Uren. And it is still an open question which exerts the most power.
Wow.
So in 1896, he actually ran for the state house. He won a seat. And at this time, the Oregon state legislature wasn't just divided between parties. There were actually very, very few Democrats in the legislature. It's mostly populists and Republicans. But there's lots of division within the Republican Party, a lot of factions. And in 1897, a fight broke out over the re-election of U.S. Senator John Mitchell.
Like a physical fight or like a
Oh, I
electoral
don't
fight?
no, I hope there's a physical fight. It would make this more interesting. Um, but, this was before the direct election of US senators, right? So the legislature voted on who the US senator would
Right.
be. Uren saw his chance in the division, so he helped organize a coalition between populists, the few Democrats that were there, and a faction of Republicans who were known as the Silver Republicans. And this coalition actually refused to attend sessions. They denied a quorum. This was, akin to a walkout, what we call a walkout now. Um, this legislative session became known as the Hold-Up Legislature. A member of this Hold-Up coalition had different demands, and one of them from UREN was an initiative and referendum amendment. Now there was a lot of pushback. They actually blocked up the whole legislative session. It didn't even happen. The Senate met a little bit. The House completely run to the ground for that session. Um, a lot of these members, the public wasn't exactly happy about this. There were probably other things they wanted to get done, even if they may have agreed with the reformers on some things. So a lot of these people lost re-election or they retired, including Uren. But the momentum was there. Reform Republicans became more dominant within the party and the legislature. Uren, in his time outside the legislature, founded the Direct Legislative League to kind of push from the outside. And then, convening in 1899, the new legislature came together to re-elect that U.S. Senator, John Mitchell, who all of them didn't like, but they also passed the resolution for a constitutional amendment for initiative and referendum. And then in 1902, voters approved that constitutional amendment with 92% support, which is, pretty high even for that. There was one state, Nebraska, where it was 0.5% higher, but yeah, 92% is a high number. So Oregon was the second state to adopt the initiative process after South Dakota, but it was the first to use it. And funny enough, in 1904, voters approved one of the first statewide ballot initiatives in the United States, and that was to provide for the direct election of U.S. senators from
Hmm.
Oregon.
Wow, yeah, 92%. It's pretty rare for ballot measures at all to get approved at what essentially amounts to near unanimous support. And so you mentioned that South Dakota was the first to adopt the initiative process. How does Oregon's use of the initiative compare to other states?
Yeah, so it wasn't just the first. Oregon didn't just have the first citizen initiated ballot measure, but it's had the most.
Mm.
So since 1900, voters in Oregon have weighed in on 445 citizen initiated ballot measures. It's actually one more than California. So they're currently neck and neck.
Oh, California might catch up next year then.
Yeah, California might catch up, and I'll explain a little bit more about why later. So then Colorado comes in third with 270. So there's a pretty big gap after Oregon and California.
Yeah.
And Oregon's averaged about 30 initiatives per decade, with a huge spike early on, which isn't surprising, nearly 100 in the first decade. Things slowed down in the 1960s a little bit and then picked back up. But we're seeing it slow down again. And depending on what happens in the next couple of years, the 2020s are having a pretty low number of initiatives in Oregon. So while if you look at Oregon compared to other states right now, you're like, okay, they have a pretty normal number of initiatives. But compared to itself over its previous decades, it's been relatively quiet in Oregon recently.
Got it. So, what were some of the early initiatives in Oregon? And are we seeing any kind of similar proposals or categories of initiatives today?
Yeah, so this is another fun William Uren story here. So, for example, just a few months ago, November 2024, Oregon voters voted on and rejected a measure to adopt ranked choice voting. Ranked choice voting is often seen as a contemporary idea. Um, but we've looked into this a little bit before with historical ballot measures, and it's kind of like it's really like a second wave. So in Oregon, the first wave came in the early 1900s when voters considered a series of proposals for alternative electoral systems, especially ones that they described as proportional representation. I know that word can mean a lot, especially if you're a political scientist or something. That's the term they tended to use for them. Um, these measures didn't use the phrase ranked choice voting, but they often involved ranking candidates, especially for multi-member seats. That's where the proportional idea comes in. So in 1908, voters actually approved a constitutional amendment allowing, not requiring, but allowing the use of electoral systems that enable voters to make, in quotes, direct or indirect expression of his first, second, or additional choices. So this language is still in the Oregon Constitution today. In some states, there's often constitutional questions that come up around ranked choice voting. So this 1908 amendment kind of gives Oregon a lot of legal room to play around with various electoral systems that involve ranking. But of course, following 1908, voters actually weighed in on three proportional representation proposals from 1910 to 1914, all of which our friend William Uren was involved in, but voters rejected all of them.
Huh. Oh, Mr. Uran is very active and very busy, it sounds like, back in the early 20th century. So, over the past 125 years, what other kinds of issues have come up most often on Oregon's ballot?
Yeah, so this is always a fun one to look at. And of course, there's always things like taxes, especially property tax exemptions that we see across the states. But I looked for some that were a bit more unique to Oregon. And while these do occur in other states, they are kind of interesting to think about. So, one that isn't purely unique to Oregon, but is definitely something we see a lot more on the West Coast from Alaska to California: salmon and fishing in general, but especially the salmon. So, starting in 1908, there have been nearly 20 citizen initiated ballot measures related to fishing and fisheries. The first one, again, approved all the way back in 1908, actually restricted salmon and sturgeon fishing in the Columbia River. The most recent one, which was defeated in 2012, would have prohibited non-tribal commercial fishers from using gill nets to catch salmon. So between 1908 and 2012, voters approved to ban commercial fishing on certain rivers or specific commercial fishing methods. About half of those passed, about half of them didn't. So this is a recurring and often divisive topic in Oregon ballot measure
Huh.
history.
Is that something that comes up in other states as well? Are fishing measures like that a common thing?
It's definitely a West Coast thing. Alaska's had a lot, Washington has had a lot, California as well. And again, they often involve salmon. It's I think you can understand probably why. It's an economic uh source in a lot of those states, especially historically. There's lots of also passion around salmon and um cultural relevance and things like that. So yeah, it's been a big issue out west. And I think the other one to kind of briefly discuss is the death penalty. It's been on the ballot in a lot of states. But what's kind of unique about Oregon is this back and forth. 1912, voters reject ballot measure to abolish death penalty. 2 years later, they approve one, death penalty abolished. 1920, they approve one to reinstate it. 1964, they ban it again. 1978, they reinstate it. So over the last century, Oregon voters have like repeatedly decided the fate of the death penalty at the ballot box, kind of going back and forth.
I like what you did there, deciding the fate of death penalty. Yeah, I can't remember what you're talking about. Okay, so there's been a lot of recent discussion in 2025 in particular about education and different policies in different states, and in particular, say, school choice. Um, has Oregon ever voted on school choice policies or other education related ballot measures? And kind of what role has that played in shaping the debate? So uh, tell us about all that, Ryan.
Yeah, so I think Oregon actually plays a really prominent role in the school choice policy realm, and not perhaps for the reasons that people think. So there's actually only been one ballot measure to adopt a school choice policy in Oregon in 1990. Voters considered a ballot initiative that would have enacted kind of a broad set of school choice policies, open enrollment for public schools, a refundable tax credit for private and homeschooling expenses, a creation of a specific fund to kind of help build these programs. But voters rejected it. 68% voted no. But I think the bigger legacy to school choice policy isn't actually school choice policy in Oregon, perhaps the opposite, which resulted in a Supreme Court ruling actually 100 years ago this year. So in 1922, voters approved a citizen initiated ballot measure to require children between the ages of 8 and 16 to attend public school. So compulsory public school education. This measure actually came up to provide some context in kind of this era of debate over immigration and especially Southern Europeans and Catholicism and things of that sort. The Scottish Rite Masons actually launched the initiative. Um, the Oregon Historical Society reported that it actually received a lot of support from the KKK, which was a bit pretty active in Oregon at the time. So while supporters framed the measure as a way to promote unity and assimilation, the Oregon Historical Society kind of summarizes it as being more driven by anti-Catholic sentiment, fears that Catholic schools fostered loyalty to the Pope over American institutions, things of that sort. So voters passed this, but some Catholic institutions sue. 1925, the U.S. Supreme Court comes down with a unanimous ruling, and a lot of this language has been cited in school choice policy debates and summaries. And I'll just read a very small excerpt from the court ruling that is often highlighted by school choice proponents. So, in quotes, the child is not the mere creature of the state. The fundamental theory of liberty, upon which all governments of the Union rest, excludes any general power of the state to standardize its children by forcing them to accept instruction from public teachers only. So, while this wasn't a school choice policy, it was perhaps the opposite. The ruling that came from it is perhaps foundational for those later policies because, it kind of provides the bedrock of the idea that you can't mandate only public
Hmm.
schools.
Right. Okay. Well, yeah, that certainly does seem to have had quite the impact. You never really know when these measures come about what they're going to lead to down the road. I'm gonna hit you with a couple of rapid fire questions really quickly, then Ryan, about some of the other interesting measures that we've seen in Oregon. So, for instance, in 1936, Oregon voters rejected a ballot initiative to create a state-owned bank. Is that something that has happened in other states before? Is that common? Was that kind of a really unique measure to come before voters? Are there any state owned banks out there? It just seems like a pretty fascinating one. And given that it happened in 1936 and the Great Depression era, you can understand why that was happening. But what do we know about that measure or other ones like it?
Yeah, it is a really interesting one. It wasn't approved, right? It was rejected. 75% voted no on it. But we have seen ballot measures like that in a few other states, and I think the most famous one is actually North Dakota. North Dakota is, I believe, the only state with a state-owned bank, at least kind of like a general one. And that came through a ballot measure itself. And then there were ballot measures to abolish the North Dakota State Bank, which were not successful. So yeah, it's definitely one of those things, and you can see the time period 1936, as you pointed out, that came up around then. Um, and I believe North Dakota was the only one that kind of had a successful ballot measure on this.
That's pretty interesting about North Dakota. Apparently, they must like being the only state for certain things. North Dakota is also the only state that does not require voters to register. Okay, and then tell us a little bit about, so you were saying, the 1910s was obviously that was the busiest decade for Oregon ballot measures that we've seen, but the 1990s was the second busiest and sort of most voluminous decade of measures in Oregon. So, what were some of the themes and topics in the 1990s that led to it being such a high period of activity?
Yeah, so in the 1990s, you definitely had like some big social issue pushes, but also I think in the 90s, and this is true across the country, like the 80s, 90s, you also had like more uh conservative organizations involved in the ballot initiative process at that point. And we saw some really interesting ones come from that side as well. So, in terms of the social issues, 1994, Oregon actually became the first state to approve an initiative authorizing physician assisted death, which of course is a very controversial topic. Um, but we also saw some really interesting ones about a debate that we see a lot today, the administrative state and those kind of concepts. In the 90s, Oregon's rejected ballot measures that would have kind of given the legislature power to review and approve and reject administrative rules. And then one that did get passed, we saw lots of, again, I mentioned more conservative or libertarian type angles. We saw tons of them related to taxes in the 80s and 90s. So a big one in Oregon was 1996 constitutional amendment to require a 60% vote to pass revenue raising bills. So, right, more than a simple majority to kind of get anything that's going to potentially increase taxes through the legislature.
Got it. Okay. Well, are we monitoring anything particularly sort of noteworthy or new in Oregon this year when it comes to initiative activities? We've spent this whole, past 20 minutes or so talking about the history of initiatives and ballot measures in Oregon. What's going on in this year and what are we looking for in 2026?
Yeah, so there are no ballot measures currently certified for Oregon's 2026, but that's not unusual at this stage, whether it's from the legislature or citizen initiatives. That said, there are several initiative campaigns that are already active. One would require voter approval for new toll roads. Another seeks to eliminate certain exemptions in animal treatment laws. But I think the one to closely watch at this point, because of who's backing it, there's one that's backed by some major national groups, specifically the ACLU and Planned Parenthood. They're currently the top donors. And when you see organizations of this scale fund a signature drive, that usually signals a good chance of it making the ballot. So there's a citizen-initiated constitutional amendment that would amend Oregon's Equal Rights Amendment. That's a term some people may be familiar with from kind of the proposed federal amendment. Oregon has one. It prohibits denying rights on account of sex. What this proposal would do is actually define sex, because currently it doesn't, right? So the amendment would define that these rights based on sex cannot be decided based on pregnancy outcomes, so abortion. That's obviously been a big issue. Gender identity and sexual orientation. It would also repeal the Oregon Constitution's existing language that bans same-sex marriage. So I think everyone knows at this point abortion has been a major ballot measure issue since Dobbs, really since Roe, if you want to go all the way back. And we're seeing a growing number of efforts to repeal same-sex marriage bans. Many of these are inoperative, unenforceable, but they still remain on the books, right? Now, gender identity and kind of related medical issues have been a prominent national topic for sure, but we haven't really seen that play out in the ballot measure arena. But that may be starting to change. We're definitely seeing them kind of creep up in a number of states right now, and we're keeping an eye on them.
I'm sure there'll be more Oregon developments in the coming weeks and months ahead, and we'll certainly be keeping a close eye on that as we do with all ballot measure activity. Uh, Listeners can follow along with all of that in our State Ballot Measure Monthly newsletter, or all of our on-site articles and content, or the Daily Brew newsletter as well. Ryan, looking forward to having you back on to talk about our next state sometime in June.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And for our listeners, you can learn more about Oregon's ballot measure history and some other states that we have published historical ballot measure factbooks on at the link in our show notes. We'll be back later this week with another episode. Make sure you subscribe to On the Ballot wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Geoff Pallay, and thanks for listening.